Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started today, just want to remind you that one of the ways we keep the lights on around here is, of course, subscriptions to Blaze TV. So if you want to get the behind the scenes access to all your favorite Blaze hosts, and you also want to support what we're doing here, make sure you go to blazetv.com/Auron to get your $20 off your subscription today. That's blazetv.com/Auron. All right, guys. So it is, of course, Halloween, and I wanted to bring you a spooky tale of history repeating itself. We have a situation where we've had a protracted government shutdown. If you're not one of the people who's really dependent on the government, you probably didn't even notice. I often forget the government is shut down at all. But actually, there are, of course, classes that are entirely dependent on the government in the United States. One of them is those that are receiving food stamps. And if the government continues to be shut down, into tomorrow, we are supposed to see the first round of food stamps being cut off from those who depend on it. We also have a situation where the military hasn't been paid in over a month, and we have a billionaire stepping in to cover the cost of the military to pay their wages. An interesting parallel, again, with the Roman Empire, where you had a lot of private men end up funding these different armies. So the grain dole might end, and the legions are being funded by these patricians. It's a very interesting time, and I think that has some interesting parallels to the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire. So joining me today to talk about that is a frequent guest on the show. He's a historian. He runs the Cost of Glory podcast. Alex Petkas, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Great to be on, Auron, as usual. In times of late Republican turmoil, there's always something to talk about.
Yeah, this is one of those scenarios where obviously some of this is just we're having fun, we're kind of drawing these parallels. But of course, it's also serious. I mean, we'll take, as we were saying backstage, we'll take any opportunity to talk about Roman history. So this is a good excuse as any. But I do think it is interesting to evaluate the ways that this, again, if it doesn't repeat, at least is rhyming with the way that history has happened before. We know that even if these issues aren't exactly the same, there are signs of civilizational instability, right? These are things that we can trace through. We know how they flesh themselves out in Rome. Some of them were critical to fall of the Roman Empire, or the Republic rather. Others, maybe not so much. Maybe they just contributed. They ultimately became too much for the empire to bear. But it really does create an interesting scenario where we can kind of trace those events and try to see how well they map on, so we can make some predictions about what's going on here. In fact, from what I've heard, they're pushing to kind of end the filibuster in the Senate. We might get a straight up and down vote to end this whole thing soon. So who knows? This might not even ultimately happen, but I still think it's worth understanding because these moments are very important, and we could easily be back here again, given the instability and disagreement in our government. So let's start with the grain dole. This is a scenario I think some people have probably heard about this, that the Roman government was providing bread at some level, providing grain at some level for the average person. But I don't think they understand how integral it became to certain aspects of life, especially in the Eternal City, and how this being taken away or threatened, the food supply, these kind of things, how critical it could be to just changing the demeanor, changing the stability inside the Roman Republic and then Empire. So can you start a little bit by explaining what the grain dole is and where it came from, what time it started, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so people often associate the grain dole with this quote, the bread and circuses that keep the city of Rome peaceful. That's a quote from Juvenal, which is, about a century and a half into the reign of the emperors. And, it's typically associated with this decadent late Roman period where the plebs are just wallowing in entertainments and the emperor is kind of sitting serenely on top of a, bureaucracy. But it actually begins quite early. I mean, in the span of Roman history, in the mid to late Republic, in the first grain dole legislation comes under Tiberius Gracchus, and Gracchus is famous for this. So we're talking 130s BC. These are the famous populists, the Gracchi brothers, and who are famous for redistributing land, getting lynched by the Senate for trying to champion the interest of the working man and the kind of common Roman soldier. But in the Rome of Tiberius Gracchus's day, you had a great increase in population to the city of Rome in the wake of the Punic Wars, which were fought not least over the island of Sicily, which is kind of the breadbasket ultimately of Rome. And certainly at this period, Sicily, in addition to Sardinia, is another very important, Corsica, Sardinia especially, very important cereal agriculture regions. And the problem is the city of Rome is not at some point easily able to sustain the food needs of the populace, because it's one of the biggest cities in the world at this time. I think it, by Gracchus's day, maybe it hasn't quite surpassed Alexandria, but it soon will. And it's a lot harder to ship in grain, or to cart in grain from the countryside, because it's expensive to carry. It's like 10 times as expensive to cart things a mile than it is to sail them via ship. And so you start to have grain imports being a really important part of the supply of food in the city. And with the population increasing, every spike in prices or every glut of supply, it has ramifications in the capital. So if there's a bad harvest, or especially in the late Republic, you get this problem of piracy, that can really put a squeeze on the city of Rome. And so Gracchus proposed this law and passed it, where Roman citizens would be entitled not to free grain, but to grain at a fixed price. And this supply that he secured was 5 modii a month. And a modius is like 2 gallons of dry grain. So if you do the math, that's a modius, I think, is something like 22,000 calories. So multiply that by 5, add a little olive oil, and you got enough food to not starve. If you've got a wife, you got maybe a baby in the house, maybe a slave. It's enough for a small family to just get by. And if you supplement it with olive oil or fruits, or the occasional rind of pork you get at a festival, you can get by. And it's a big piece of the diet for a lot of citizens already at that time, the grain. And then with the grain dole coming in, it becomes very important. It becomes a kind of entitlement. And there's a funny story, actually. So the grain dole, it's important to emphasize, you have a fair bit of foreigners moving into Rome, peddling their wares, settling, Greeks and Carthaginians. But the Roman grain dole is only for citizens, and it's only for males. So it's essentially, the idea is, if you're a head of household, you can get enough grain to supply your household. And there was stiff opposition to this law, as you can expect. People are like, well, how are we going to pay for all this? This is going to create a dependent underclass, etc. But the grain dole did not require you to be below a certain property or income level. And so one of the senators who was fiercely opposed, like the greatest opponent of this law, after the grain law gets passed, he shows up in the bread line a few days later, and somebody asks him, well, what are you doing here? And he says, oh, I'm here to get my share of my property, my mea bona. So obviously a very rich man who had no need for the grain dole. So it was contentious, but once it passed, there's just no chance of repealing it. And that became the standard for a while, the Gracchus grain dole at a fixed price.
So obviously the parallels here are pretty easy, right? Like, we have this constant need to provide a certain amount of food to at least the poor at that time, though, as you say, it can be claimed by everyone, even if they ultimately didn't need it. Now, as you point out, this is them buying it at a fixed price as opposed to just immediately receiving it. But obviously this is being heavily subsidized. That's why it stays at that price. So you still have a situation where it's more or less welfare, though it will require some level of work and payment ultimately from these people. Now, it's a populist adjustment. And this is, of course, interesting because we always know that the populists come in and they want to break up the order as it is. They're offering, better wages, more farmland, the bread, the grain. There's always the situation where you're pointing out that so much of the system has been locked up by the elites, and this is inherently going to be something that's very unpopular with the elites. As you point out, the Gracchi are lynched by the Senate ultimately for their insistence on pushing these populist uh, policies. And of course, this moves all the way up to Julius Caesar. A lot of people know he's a populare against the Optimates. And so you have this scenario where a lot of people can look at Donald Trump, and even though we think, conservative, small government, these kind of things, we can kind of see that parallel of him moving along. And even though he's technically supposed to be the Republican Party, the party of small government, he clearly isn't really afraid of entitlements. He actually embraces, in many ways, making sure that people get checks and these kind of things, because he gets like kind of the basic transactional nature of politics in a way that the wider Republican Party doesn't. Like, I pay you and then you vote for me, right? Like, this is, I do things that benefit you, and then ultimately, you benefit me. A very patronage style relationship that was very in favor in Rome. Of course, the patron system was really built into their social order, one that we don't recognize today officially. We tend to not approve of this, but is very clearly there. So I'm wondering, in this scenario, how did the grain dole evolve over time? Did it continue to stay a fixed price? Was it eventually just free? Did the amount increase? What challenges were there in attempting to keep that supply going? Did they eventually have to move beyond? I believe Egypt eventually became a critical player when it came to feeding Rome. What are some of the things that how the kind of grain dole evolved both politically and logistically for Rome?
Well, one of the interesting things that starts to happen is after this grain law is passed, is suddenly there is, well, obviously there's an incentive. If you can get your name on that list of people entitled to grain, you're going to find a way. And one of the things that happens, the list of people getting the grain dole grows over time. And one of the mechanisms for this happening is masters freeing their slaves. And when you free a slave, he becomes a client of yours. Often you free your slaves and then he just sticks around as your employee, especially if you've had good relations with them, which is what is generally advised. And so people will free a slave, and then the slave as a freedman will get the right to have the grain dole himself. So it's kind of like, the way that employers will find ways to get their own employees subsidized somehow.
Right.
by the food stamp system. People criticize Walmart for this. Well, you set up the incentives in a certain way, people are going to take advantage of it. By the really late Republic, so the days of Julius Caesar and Cicero, the grain lists have gotten bigger and out of control, and there are attempts to some successful attempts to ratchet it back by making it so that you can only be not a freedman but a free-born Roman citizen. And there are people that are Italians who have moved in from the countryside, and they say, no, you have to be like a native Roman. You have to be domiciled in Rome. You can't just be here, renting an apartment for a day or two a week to get your grain ticket. So there's all kinds of ways that people try to game the system, as I think you and I would too if we were hungry. But so one of the attempts to kind of rationalize that comes in the after the Civil War with Julius Caesar. But let's get to that in a moment, because there's an important development that happens before that, which is in 58 BC, one of the great mobster populists of the era of the late Republic, Publius Clodius, passes a law to basically make the grain dole free. And you can imagine this was met with stiff opposition, but Clodius got the law passed. And after that point, by that point, the grain roster had swelled from something like in the 40,000s in the days of Gracchi to something like 300,000 in the days of Clodius. So it's really gotten big, and it's a huge burden on the state. And Cicero is found right around this period. Cicero hates Clodius, so he has some kind of incentive to swell the number, but it's plausible because it's so much grain that this, Cicero says it's 1/5 of the annual revenue of the state is earmarked for paying for this free grain to the citizenry of Rome. So, once again, once you pass it, you can't really undo it. But it creates a lot of supply problems. So it's one thing to pass the law to distribute this grain and to actually pay for it, but if you can't supply it, if you can't find the grain, then prices are going to rise for the state, and they're going to be shouldered with even more of the burden. And that is when in 57, I think it is, Pompey the Great, who's one of Rome's great politicians, payer of his own armies, which we'll get to in a bit. He has a friend, namely Cicero and some other people, propose him for this novel office called the prefect of the grain, the praefectus annoni. Annona is the Roman word for the grain dole, which has something to do, well, etymologically has something to do with like the yearly supply of food. But Pompey is basically charged with making sure that there is enough grain to buy at decent prices, and going around to Sicily, Sardinia, arranging things with merchants. Egypt isn't quite part of the equation yet, but North Africa by that point, the Romans control quite securely after the Third Punic War, and that becomes another, probably the biggest staple of the, we don't think of Africa as a very fertile region, but northern Tunisia and Algeria, big grain producing areas in the Roman world. And so the prefect of the grain, interestingly, is not just some kind of bureaucratic negotiator office. Pompey has imperium with this office. It's essentially like a military office. So he can take warships around and kind of strong arm people if there's any kind of crime going around, grain hoarding. He can put some muscle behind Rome's claims to get good access to good grain. And it ends up being a 5-year office, and it's one of the bases on which he kind of holds power in Rome through being the man behind the Roman police force. Like if there's a lot of riots going on in this period, some of them may be grain related, probably a lot of them mostly political. And so Pompey, when things get rough, he can step in, crack down with troops in the city, which normally can't do, but he can do it as the commissioner of the grain supply, which is really interesting. So it shows you how big of an issue this is, and also how much Pompey felt that being the man, being the grain boss, was a desirable kind of popular facing political office. And fast forward to the days of Julius Caesar, I think this is also really interesting. So the grain supply has managed to continue to flow into Rome even over the period of the Civil War, which starts in 49 to 46 is the most violent part of the Civil War. And once Caesar wins most of the Civil War, there's still a flare-up going on in Spain that he has to take care of later. But once he gets back to Rome after killing, the Optimates, and Cato commits suicide in Africa, Caesar comes back to Rome, and as dictator, he holds a drastic review of the receivers of the grain dole, and cuts the number from 100,000 to something like 160, I believe it is. It's in the mid hundreds. So he basically cuts the eligibility in half for all the people receiving grain, and he specifies not only, okay, you have to be a Roman male citizen. That was there from the beginning, but maybe people were abusing this, and so he reasserts this and makes sure that everybody's complying with this. But he also institutes a lot system by which not everybody who is theoretically eligible is going to get a share of the grain, and you have to draw lots. And there's a weighted system by which the more kids you have, the better a chance you have of getting grain. So he's, it's a kind of pro-natalist policy on Caesar's part. which, pronatalism you can kind of see developing in the reign of Caesar, and it continues with Augustus, but you can sort of see that policy intersecting with his grain policy at this point, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so it becomes obviously, as we'd expect, unfortunately, with any kind of state program, any kind of welfare, it starts to become something that is constantly being offered and increased. It's something that you can use as a wedge against kind of the entrenched powers by offering more of it. Once it's there, like you said, it's just not going to go away of itself. It's too popular with the people. Obviously, however, it does become a logistical football, and very interesting that Pompey is able to kind of use that office that otherwise probably would not be one that just kind of covers you in glory, right? It's not something that a lot of people would be fighting for, but he recognizes the political utility of it, not just because he's in charge of this critical, kind of patronage thing that he gets to decide where it goes, but also because it gives him special privileges, as you say, to move troops in and crack down on law and control the riots. Basically, he gets to circumvent the Roman constitution. This is the state of exception that he gets to deploy by holding this particular office. So this is a Carl Schmitt, would see him as the sovereign. He gets to decide when you get to suspend those rules. It's also very interesting that in order to really bring this back under control at all, of course, as we see with so much of kind of the Roman Republic, you have to see Caesar step in and cut the Gordian knot just across the board, right? Like you have the dictator, he can make the decisions. It doesn't matter if this is politically popular or not anymore, because now there is no more politics. This guy is now in charge, and so he can make these decisions that no one else could make. So you end up in this scenario where obviously the larger kind of more democratic mechanism, the Republican mechanism, basically has been entirely hacked by the grain dole. The grain dole gets to decide a lot of the political order. And then the only way to really make any of that go away, the only way to reform that at all, is to bring in a guy who just no longer has to worry about the Republican order, no longer has to worry about the Democratic input, and that incentive no longer necessarily exists for him to be completely loyal to that program. So ultimately, does the grain dole stay with us until like the fall of the Western Empire? Are there big interruptions? Does it eventually see another scaling back? Does it become even more critical to the people in the Eternal City? Like, what's kind of the final fate of the grain dole?
Yeah, so one of the things that people were hesitant about in instituting something like this is the Romans are very reluctant to establish any kind of permanent bureaucratic system or office. When they are supplying their army, they contract the food supply and the arms supply out to private bidders, and that gives the politicians the power to play them off each other, get the best price, go with another alternative. And it also prevents people from kind of holding the state by the leash, let's call it. So people were reluctant to see an official office of grain supply develop, you can imagine, because that's just far from the Roman mindset. But you start to get some centralization of the power, both, from the time of the Gracchus reforms. That's when we start to see proper state-sponsored, state-owned granaries in the city of Rome. Clodius appointed, when he made the grain free, he appointed his own guy to be in charge of all the grain. And then, of course, you can imagine this would happen. Cicero and Clodius's enemies quickly accuse that guy of skimming a bunch off for himself, and the corruption gets involved. But you see the establishment under, it's kind of steps made in that direction under Caesar of establishing permanent offices that are in charge of the grain supply. And Caesar starts by adding a couple of aediles, who are the cereal aediles. Ceres is the god of grain, and so they're the aediles of Ceres. And once Caesar is killed, Augustus kind of follows in his footsteps and establishes a an office of well, it's not called the prefect of the grain, which becomes the official title in the later Roman Empire, but somebody who is directly answerable to him. And he is actually, as part of his early powers of supreme command, basically Augustus, the way that he constructed his imperial authority was by cobbling together existing forms of power from the Republican system. He gets elected consul in sequence over and over and over. He resists the offer of dictator. He's never dictator, but he has these other powers that give him a kind of dictatorial authority, including the tribunician power. He kind of takes over the champions of the people's role. But one of the early offices that he accepted when it was offered to him by the Senate is the office of the prefect of the grain. And so this was clearly very important to him. And it's funny, actually, after Caesar was assassinated, Brutus and Cassius are, they're still in the city, these guys who have orchestrated this conspiracy, and the Senate wants to get rid of them, kind of let the situation cool down. And so they assign them the job of going and buying grain. They're like official grain buyers, as one of their tasks to get them the hell out of Rome. But the grain dole continues and grows in importance in Rome, and it gets bigger. There is and there's attempts to retrench it by Augustus's time. It has swelled up, to the several hundreds of thousands. Again, he cuts it back to 200,000. But by the end of his reign, Augustus has captured Egypt, or annexed Egypt, and that's when Egypt starts to get more important under the reign of Augustus. So Egypt, of course, the Nile, you could just like spit out your sunflower seeds, and like sunflower plants will just blow up in that spot. It's just so fertile. So there's just a ton of grain in the Nile Valley. And we think of Egypt, if you're a kind of Roman history nerd, as being the breadbasket of the empire, but it's not for a long time that Egypt really becomes more important, if ever, than Africa, say, or Sicily, to the grain supply of Rome. But under Augustus, there's like clear political ramifications. If you're familiar with the story of Augustus, there's this revolt of one of the sons, the rebel sons of Pompey, Sextus Pompey, this pirate lord, as he's often called, who takes control of Sicily and actually threatens Rome with starvation in 40 to 39 BC. So it continues to be just a key thing that you have to handle as the emperor. The emperor, though, it's like one of the main duties of the emperor to make sure that there is enough grain and that you can pay for it and subsidize it and give it for free to the people. But it basically never goes away. This is one of the perks of being a poor person in Rome, is you get the bread and the circuses. And later on, there are things added to the free food dole. I think it's under the reign of Septimius Severus. 3rd century BC AD. They start adding olive oil. At some point, you get some pork belly, and various things are added. And I think it's important to understand the shift in the importance. Like, why is this politically important? Okay, under the Republic, it's politically important because these are your voters. But in the empire, it's politically important because these people can rise up and kill you. That you don't want the riots, which is not such an issue under the Republic. I mean, there's plenty of reasons that people riot in the Republic, and there are mobsters manipulating the crowd. But
luckily there'd be nothing like that today.
Yeah. Thank God that we've solved that problem today.
Right. Civilized as we are, yeah.
With nothing to do. But so you don't really have like mobsters running around. The emperor can just kill them or have them arrested. But if you don't feed the people, they're going to get pissed and they're going to rise up. So it's constantly on the mind. If there's a famine, this is the sort of thing that can topple an emperor. So they have to keep it up. It starts to get more sporadic in the late Roman period in Rome, because at that point, by the mid 4th century AD, Rome is not, it's sort of the capital in name, but Milan is more important politically, militarily. It's close to the border. Constantinople becomes important, and Constantinople is, of course, getting grain from Egypt. This is the norm. So basically, once you start these handouts, and the emperor really, you got to remember, the emperor is sort of the populist of populists, right? He is the champion of the lower classes of the people of Rome. In Rome, if you are the poorest nobody, you can see the statue of the emperor in your, market town, and you can throw some incense on the altar to his genius, and you can just have this hope that the emperor is going to reach out and help you one day if you could just get your petition in front of the right person at Rome or Constantinople. And so it's a big piece of a kind of populist monarch's self-presentation, that he's able to feed the people and keep the grain supply going. Never stops at Rome.
Yeah, so obviously, I don't think we have to, work too hard to draw the parallels, of course, to our current situation. I think many people were shocked to see how many tens of millions of people are on food stamps on a regular basis in the United States, and the percentage of them that are ultimately foreign born. It seems like a large amount of our, of our system is going to once again kind of subsidize the importation of a number of people who will vote for a particular party, for a particular way of life, but are not ultimately contributing to the larger pie. So I don't think we have to belabor those comparisons too much, but very interesting to think ultimately of that this is also a ticking time bomb at some level for the American republic. And will it continue? Will it shape? Will it mold the way that our elections move forward? Could it end up creating bread riots? These things are interesting. Again, I've got a feeling that they will eventually work this out, before that probably stretches too far. But obviously, we know that the Democrats aren't exactly sad about ultimately civil disruption if they think it's going to hurt Donald Trump. And so we can see this as kind of the weapon that it is between our political classes. Now, we spent a lot of time on the grain dole, so sadly we won't be able to spend as much on the second aspect. But the other kind of thing that is repeating itself is that the government shutdown has created a scenario where we're not paying our troops. And this is one of those classic keys. I don't know if you've ever read The Dictator's Handbook, but it's one of those things like what is the first thing you do? You pay the guys with guns. Always pay the guys with guns. And this, of course, is something that many savvy Roman politicians knew all too well. But we are not paying the guys with guns, and instead we have Timothy Mellon of that fortune, committing $130 million of his own money to this. And it's particularly interesting because Mellon is kind of more one of those old WASP money, right? Like this is the classic. This is the American ruling elite in the most classic sense. These are your patriarchs. These are your aristocrats who are kind of coming to the forefront and paying for the Legion at that time. And of course, the minute that the troops are seeing their pay tied to an individual rather than to a system, then you'll see generally their loyalty will often shift from the idea of being loyal to the system or the country, and instead being loyal to where that pay is coming from. I know this is something that, of course, we did see in the Roman Republic and Empire. So I was wondering if you could give us kind of a brief history of, I guess, kind of the Marian reforms, like the shift from the citizen soldier to the professional soldier, the paid soldier, what that meant, and then how that developed as kind of rich men started to fund legions rather than having the legions be something that had to fund themselves, being a source of honor, that you could afford the armor, you could afford the weapon, you could afford the horse, and that was your role as a citizen in society, to be a soldier, to serve in the legions like that.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it was seen as an honor to serve in the army. I mean, that's a bit of a spin on it. Of course, a lot of these guys who are supposed to be eager for the honor are being forcibly recruited or at least strong armed into fighting if they don't feel like it. But there are real prizes to fighting in Rome's wars. But that is true that there was a swath of the populace that was seen as unfit for combat, both because they were, not of the fighting aristocratic classes or the kind of citizen, yeoman soldier classes farming their own lands, or because they were just too poor to pay for armor. And it had always been the responsibility of citizens to kind of cover their own expenses. And, the amount that you could dedicate to your own arms sort of determines your rank in the army. Are you a light armed skirmisher with a little, trash can lid type thing made out of wicker and chucking a spear or slingshot at people, or are you, a legionary, full kind of hoplite armor, or are you an equestrian? Can you afford a horse? But this starts to be a problem as Rome's wars get to be longer term, foreign, or all around the Mediterranean. In the late 2nd century BC, Rome is locked in a two wars at the same time, two major wars. One of them is in modern day France and Gaul, where these Celtic tribes, eventually it's the Cimbri and the Teutones, are the ones that the sources talk about, are pushing up against the borders of Rome. They're talking about invading Italy. There's talk of them having 300,000 men under arms, and they've got their wives and kids with them. They got their wagons. They're ready to invade and have a good, population resettlement, Volkerwanderung, for some Lebensraum. And then there's also a war going on in Africa with Jugurtha, this rebel Numidian prince. And so the legions really start to be stretched thin. I mean, there's also stuff going on in Spain. There's always kind of some flare up, and there's not a lot of troops. And there's this huge war at the Battle of Arausio in 105 BC that just apparently wiped out 100,000 Roman soldiers and a couple of consuls. I mean, just really struggling to fill the register of citizens. And so it's at this time that a great populace rises, and that's Gaius Marius. And Marius is a sort of junior officer for the consul serving in Africa. And Marius, looking around at the scene, fighting in the Jugurthine War for a couple of years, he gets an idea of how the war can be won, and it's with a troop surge. And so Marius, kind of against the orders and the will of his own general, he goes back to Rome to run for the consulship for the next year, promising that he'll end the war, within a year or two. And his promised method for doing that is he's going to enlist a bunch of poor Roman citizens. And he proposes this, and the Senate is basically thinks he's nuts, and this is a stupid idea, and that nobody should vote for Marius because he's incompetent, and he's a provincial. I mean, he's from Arpinum, which is this bumpkin land, and halfway to Naples in the mountains. So he's not from the elite clique, but he wins his election on a populist ticket, promising to end the war that the people are tired of. They're tired of the grain shortages. It's Africa, of course. They're tired of the economic pressure, and the Senate is like, all right, fine, Marius, you want to raise up an army? He has to propose this to the Senate to get their approval of it, and he manages to get it passed with them kind of daring him to do so. Like, yeah, good luck getting anybody from the proletariat to fight in the legions. They're not fighters. They're not going to follow you. And then if you do, good luck paying for it. And so Marius says, all right, thank you for that. And he recruits a couple of proper legions. He does the job. He goes to Africa. He wins the war. But what this does, historians discuss this a lot as a turning point in the history of the Roman army, is, okay, Marius does get some of the plunder from Africa, from Numidia. It's not an incredibly rich territory. He's got to figure out a way to pay his troops. He but he kind of brackets that issue for a while, and he takes his army up, wins another round of the consulship, and he goes and he defeats the Cimbri and the Teutones, these Gauls that had been threatening the border in northern France. And it takes him a couple of years, but he builds an incredibly powerful and dynamic army out of these kind of regular Joes. It's a real accomplishment. He reforms the army in other ways. He's the guy that standardized the legionary signa, the eagle. There before Marius, there was like a pig and a dog, and there's a bunch of different insignia that the legions would carry around. But Marius said, no, they're all going to be eagles. It's the bird of Jove. But after that, Marius he's basically promised them all along that they're going to get the rich rewards. And as poor men, they want this. They want to become, respectable in a way. They've been, selling trinkets on the streets or cart pullers or whatever it was in the city of Rome, or poor men from the Italian countryside. And he's promised them that he's going to make them gentlemen. And so he's got to get the Senate to approve of a land redistribution out of the public lands, and he's able to fund it, some himself from the funds that he's brought into the treasury. Marius has also gotten very rich by buying up mines in Spain. So it ends up becoming a kind of log jam in the Senate for several years before he can actually get his legionary rewards passed for his soldiers. But he manages to do it, and he sets this pattern by which soldiers start to look not to the Senate for the rewards that they get for fighting for Rome, but to a particular man. And fast forward a couple of decades. Well, before we fast forward to Crassus, this one of the problems that this creates is the conditions for the possibility of an actual civil war. Troops become loyal to Marius. He settles them in Africa. A lot of these guys are still there in the times that Julius Caesar is fighting the civil war, like their sons or grandsons, their dads or their grandfathers fought for Marius, and it means a lot to these people in Africa that Julius Caesar is now fighting a civil war in Africa. And he was Marius was married to to Caesar's aunt. So there's like a kind of hereditary patronage that happens there that, hard to imagine this happening a couple of centuries earlier in Rome. But this is the norm. But because these troops are loyal to Marius in the 80s, he gets into this conflict with another politician from the Optimate non-populist party, which is, of course, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And Sulla and Marius have this incredibly bloody civil war because they've recruited troops, many from the poor, who are expecting big rewards if their general wins. There's a kind of wager that a man takes when he joins the army now to fight, and the general is really on the hook for promising them big payoff benefits by the time they retire and are victorious. So that's often chalked up to a big cause of the civil war, that you have these loyal armies loyal to generals instead of to Rome itself. And many of them, haven't even lived in Rome ever. They're from the Italian countryside or even from the provinces. So it just really changes the dynamic.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, one of the things that Machiavelli talks about, and of course he's drawing very deeply on Rome, his Discourses on Livy is, his other major work besides The Prince. And, he points out that you really want to avoid standing armies as a republic. Like, standing armies are basically the doom of a republic because they're always going to be looking for something. They become this engine that's trying to feed itself. And this is why he warns against republics becoming these kind of imperial, civilizations, because eventually, in order to maintain that, you will have to have standing armies, and then those armies will make demands, and you have the separation of the warrior class from the citizen class instead of the citizens being warriors. That's what it means to be a citizen in a republic. Like, it's very literally service guarantee citizenship. As opposed to, you have the separate professional class of warriors and they live one way and then your average person lives another. And he says this is what just kind of rends republics apart. And he's pulling obviously deeply from the Roman model and the experience there. And so once you have these professionalized armies, and it's no longer just your job as a patrician, as an aristocrat, to fund your own ability to fight, and that's what kind of makes you a worthy citizen of able to vote and have a say. It becomes this kind of automatic thing. It becomes this separate warrior class. It starts pulling very heavily from other countries. As we start to discover that more and more of our American military isn't actually even American citizens, this again, once again, our parallels become pretty obvious, and you can see why people looking at the scenario where Mellon is personally paying these troops at this point, and you can draw again those parallels. Now, I don't think we're probably going to have him marching on Washington D.C. He's not going to be crossing the Potomac, to take control, that kind of thing. Ultimately, with the legions, but it is just interesting that these problems reemerge reliably. That these lessons that are applied by people like Machiavelli to these ancient republics really do get pulled into the modern day, and we can see the way that these interact with each other. So I know there's a much longer history of kind of what happens with the legions, and obviously we know with Caesar and Mark Antony and Octavian and their battles and everything, just the way in which armies are purchased and become loyal, and even eventually we get the Praetorian Guard, and they end up being the ones that basically determine who's going to be the emperor by whoever got the biggest bribe to them. So like this, this problem just snowballs worse and worse and worse throughout Roman history. But I was just, like I said, all of this could be over by the time we're done with this episode. They could have voted to get rid of all this problem and pay everyone and fund the government, and we'll be fine. But I just thought it was worth going back and kind of touching on these stories and reminding ourselves that these truths are eternal. They echo through history for a reason. Even if things never play out exactly the same way twice, there are really important lessons we can learn by kind of studying this context.
But I think the Mellon example, just maybe in closing, is a great reminder of that there's a different way of thinking about what your money is for. And this is what, Crassus is the richest man in Rome in the days of Julius Caesar, and Caesar's patron, in fact, enables his career. And listen to the Cost of Glory episode on Crassus, richest man in Rome. But he is famous for saying nobody is rich until they can pay for their own army.
Yeah.
And Crassus did exactly that. That's how he funded this campaign to root out the slave revolt of Spartacus. You might have seen the movie. I think Crassus gets a bad shake in that movie, but
anytime you like literally crucify thousands of people, you'll probably get a bad shake.
Yeah, it's fair. And somebody had to pay for all that wood, and Crassus knew how to do it. So there's another display of wealth in a kind of gruesome way. But I think it goes to show that in some republics, at least, the wealth is seen as only valuable in as much as it can kind of be converted. It's like fungible into political power or into honor. I think it would be the better, more respectable way to say it. And those are different things, honor and power. But this is how Crassus won, not just as a rich man, but as a politician. So it's cool to see an American rich man just in a little way playing the Crassus model. There's probably too many checks and balances in place for for him to actually be able to lead an army, charge into Persia or something like Crassus did. But it does kind of raise this question of what is the army really loyal to, and who is getting their pay, and probably these things will solve themselves shortly, but it could be different, and it is very different in other parts of the world too. And so we should be thankful for what we have, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting that Curtis Yarvin has pointed this out many times, that ultimately excess wealth is just liquid power, if properly understood. Something that I think has, in our current highly oligarchic society, we think of money as the end unto itself. But of course, anyone who really recognizes the contours of power recognizes that ultimately it only matters if you can convert it into power, because all the money in the world won't stop men with swords. And so, make sure that if you're going to spend your money, spend it wisely there. One could say it's the cost of glory. But with that terrible pun, let's transition to the questions of the people. Before we do, Alex, where can people find your fantastic podcast and the other things you're doing?
Well, if you like the biographies of the great men of Greece and Rome, you can find Cost of Glory on any podcast player or on YouTube. We've started putting out visually stimulating documentary style portrayals over the audio that I've mostly been focused on later. But costofglory.com is my website if you want to check out some other stuff that I'm up to.
And, now that Mike Duncan has just like embarrassed himself as like the world's worst, libtard, we need to support our guys. So if you're going to learn Roman history, as much as I love history of Rome, it's time to make the switch, guys. It's time to move over to one of our guys.
Listen to a show that loves Rome and loves America.
That's right. Loves Rome and puts America first. True Roman stories for true American patriots. All right, let's go to our questions here. Florida Henry says, can you pronounce that? I'm not sure.
Eumenes of Cardia. I think we got a Cost of Glory listener. Yes, thank you. That's the second guy I profiled in the Cost of Glory. He's Alexander's secretary who became a warlord. So check that one out.
So that's one of your series on your podcast.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
thank
fantastic.
you.
And then we have Jerry Warville says, what happens when you stop paying the Dane Geld, but you give the Danes a free crime pass? Alex, love Cost of Glory. Have you thought of doing a show on comparisons between Caesar and Napoleon, maybe Alexander too?
Got to do those comparisons. I'm not sure what happens when you stop paying the Dane Geld and give the Danes a free crime pass. I think that they go and take what they need, eat what you kill. maybe
as we have
to see that happening,
and as we have seen from several rather humorous, Twitter and YouTube and TikTok videos here recently. Perhaps some Danes talking about what they'll take if they don't get the Dane Geld. Let's see here. Robert Weinsfeld here just with a donation. Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate that. Florida Henry says, where do you rank Sulla in Roman history? Did everything Caesar did and died of old age? Yeah, obviously Caesar gets top billing, but when it comes to importance, what do we think about Sulla there?
Well, Caesar set himself up as the anti-Sulla, as a populist instead of an optimist. But after he became the dictator, he reinstalled the statues of Pompey and of Sulla. So I think there was a grudging respect for Sulla, who is the man who kind of made what he did possible by resurrecting the dictator's office. Although he did say, when it came to power, Sulla was a mere child for laying down the dictatorship. And so, Caesar felt that Sulla hadn't learned the ultimate lesson of power, which is never give it up.
Yeah, well, Caesar should have learned the other ultimate lesson: never forgive your enemies. So.
I think Sulla had the last laugh on that.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Orwell's Goon says Plutarch greatly overstated Marius's humble beginnings. His marriage would have been nearly impossible was he not equestrian. He was more like Robin Hood, an elite who integrated himself with the plebs. What do you think of that take?
I think that's probably right. Plutarch loves a rags to riches story, but Marius was no poor man, but he was an outsider. And, Cicero also no poor man, but, we know his career a lot better and how damn hard it was for even a wealthy outsider from the equestrian ranks to get in those charm circles. And certainly marrying into the Caesar family, the Julia Caesarus family, was one of Marius's greatest political achievements. Really made him a respectable guy, but it didn't come from nothing.
I mean, we're all fans of elite theory here. We know all kinds of rags to riches stories. Really, a lot of times, maybe that guy is still doing something impressive, but probably has some level of elite connection or ability, or he wouldn't have been able to develop that in the first place. That doesn't take away from those victories, though. And he also says, do we think Cincinnatus and the citizen farmer soldier is a dead concept in the annals of America? Well, I'll say that, I think it has been for a long time. I think this has been the struggle, ultimately, the two visions, right? Kind of the Jeffersonian versus, Hamiltonian understanding of what America would become. It's very clear that ultimately Hamilton, for better or worse, kind of won out in that battle. And this is something I try to explain. I'm not the official historian, but I try to bring this forward when I talk about political systems. That republics, they have a particular form, and you have to obey that form. And if you're not in that form, then you're just not a republic. And that's why when conservatives run around and say, well, we're a constitutional republic, like, okay, well, I mean, how many wars did you fight in? What are we limiting the franchise to? All these, classic aspects of what really defined Republican government don't really apply to the United States. And of course, the same thing happened to Rome over time as well, because ultimately, well, guys like Aristotle kind of got it right from the outset. Like there is a cycle of regimes. There are only so many forms. You have to obey the forms. You will move through these things if you're not paying attention. And so it's not surprising that the United States ended up in the same way that Rome ended up. Again, nothing is perfect one-to-one. History doesn't photocopy itself, but we can see that there are certain undeniable patterns to the way that says that civilizations develop, and we're kind of in that spot right now.
Wouldn't hurt to require military office or require military service for aspiring politicians, or who knows, for anybody to vote. That would be bring us more in line with the historical republics of the past, for sure.
Well, and if you look at the Federalist Papers, you can actually see that echoed even again by Hamilton at that time, because he's saying, well, look, we all know that standing armies are bad for republics. So like, we're obviously not going to have a standing army, but if you want us to not have a standing army, you need to turn control of your state militias over to the wider, federal government, because that's the only way we can avoid building a standing army. Now, later on, obviously, we head directly to the standing army, but the libs aren't wrong about the fact that ultimately the Second Amendment was made for the militia, but just we were always supposed to have the militia. Like that was supposed to be it. Like that the founders expected us to never have a standing army and to always have this citizen militia that that had to constantly be armed itself, which would have put us very squarely in that kind of classic Republican tradition. So the fact that we've kind of moved away from that, and many people will point out, probably correctly, that at the scale of warfare and the professionality of warfare at this point, you have to have a professional force. You have to have a standing army. You can't just train up the citizens and draw them in at any given moment. But then you are ultimately sacrificing, I think, what is a key aspect of Republican identity. And if you don't have that, then I think it's really hard to keep a republic, which is what the founders warned us about at the end of the day.
Indeed. It's hard to imagine J.D. Vance going back to his farm at this point.
Right. Grow some cabbages.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Of course, please make sure to check out Alex's podcast if you enjoyed what we are doing here today. There's just a lot more of it over there. And if it's your first time on this channel on YouTube, you need to go ahead and click subscribe, the bell, notifications, all that stuff, so you know when we go live. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you do, leave a rating or a review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.